Millionaire rushes into hospital with baby in arms. Everyone cried when they discovered why. The scorching midday sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt of the shopping mall parking lot. Alexander Morgan, heir to the Morgan fortune, walked distractedly between the cars, wearing his designer suit and dark sunglasses. At 28 years old, Alexander had it all: money, fame, and a secure future at the helm of Morgan Enterprises. However, something was missing in his life, a void that not all the gold in the world could fill. Suddenly, a faint cry reached his ears. Alexander stopped, confused. Where was that sound coming from? He looked around, but the parking lot seemed deserted. The crying grew louder, more desperate, heart racing. Alexander followed the sound until he reached an old blue sedan. Through the foggy window, he saw something that made his blood run cold: a baby no older than 6 months, crying inconsolably in its car seat. The car was locked with all the windows rolled up. The heat inside must have been unbearable. Without thinking twice, Alexander looked for something to break the window. He found a rock on the ground and, with all his strength, threw it against the glass. The window shattered and Alexander reached in to open the door. The heat that came out of the car was stifling. Carefully, he took the baby out of the car seat. It was red, sweaty, and clearly dehydrated. Alexander cradled it in his arms, feeling an instant connection with the small creature. "It's okay, little one," he murmured, as he took out his phone to call emergency services. "Everything will be all right, I promise you." While waiting for the ambulance, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about how close the baby had been to death. Who could have abandoned a defenseless creature like that? Anger and compassion mixed in his chest, along with a feeling he couldn't explain. It was as if, by holding this baby, something inside him had awakened. The ambulance arrived in minutes, and the paramedics took charge of the baby. Alexander insisted on accompanying them to the hospital. As the vehicle made its way through traffic, sirens wailing, the young millionaire couldn't take his eyes off the little one. "Will he be okay?" he anxiously asked the paramedic. "Thanks to you, yes," the man replied with a smile. A few more minutes in that car and the story would have been very different. Alexander felt a shiver. What would have happened if he had decided not to go to the mall that day? If he had parked somewhere else? Fate, he thought, sometimes acts in mysterious ways. Upon arriving at the hospital, the doctors took the baby. Away for examination, Alexander stayed in the waiting room, unable to leave. He needed to know that the little one would be okay. As he waited, his mind wandered. Who were the baby's parents? Why would they have left him alone in the car? Hours later, a doctor approached him. "Mr. Morgan, the baby is out of danger. Your heroic action saved his life." Alexander felt immense relief, but also a new determination. "Doctor, what will happen now to the baby?" "Well, the police are investigating. If they can't find the parents, he'll probably go to social services." Those words resonated in Alexander's mind. Social services. He knew that system well, though few knew it. Before being adopted by the Morgans, he had spent his first years of life bouncing from one foster home to another. "Doctor," Alexander said firmly, "I want to do everything possible to help this baby. Can I see him? Morgan, aren't you? I've seen you on the news. You must have more important things to do than stay in a hospital all night." Alexander felt a pang of irritation. Yes, he was rich and famous, but that didn't mean he didn't care about others. "Nothing is more important than a life," he replied curtly. The nurse seemed to regret her comment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend. It's just that it's not common to see someone in your position so involved." Alexander sighed. "The truth is, I feel connected to this baby in a way I can't explain." The nurse nodded understandingly. "Sometimes fate puts us on the right path at the right time." She paused and then added, "You know, the baby doesn't have a name. Maybe you'd like to suggest one?" Alexander looked at the little one through the incubator glass. A name. Something so simple, yet so powerful. "Michael," he said finally. "I'd like to call him Michael." "Michael," repeated the nurse with a smile. "It's a beautiful name. Does it have any special meaning for you?" Alexander felt a lump in his throat. It was It was my biological father's name. I never knew him, but I've always liked that name. The nurse looked at him in surprise. I didn't know you were adopted. Few people do, Alexander replied. The Morgans adopted me when I was 5 years old. Before that, well, let's say I know the foster care system well. As he spoke, memories that Alexander had kept buried for so long began to surface. He remembered lonely nights in strange beds, the changing faces of adults who never became family, the constant feeling of not belonging anywhere. Is that why you feel so connected to Michael? The nurse asked softly. Alexander nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, he said, I don't want him to go through what I went through. Nobody should feel so alone, so disposable. The nurse put a comforting hand on his shoulder. You've changed this baby's life, Mr. Morgan, and it seems to me that he's changed yours too. At that moment, as if he had heard the conversation, little Michael opened his eyes and looked directly at Alexander. Those innocent eyes seemed to see straight into his soul, awakening emotions that the young millionaire had kept dormant for years. Alexander made a decision in that instant. He didn't know how, but he was going to make sure Michael had the life that he couldn't have. And in the process, maybe he could heal the wounds of his own past. Can I hold him? He asked timidly. The nurse smiled and nodded carefully. She took the baby out of the incubator and placed him in Alexander's arms. The weight of the small body, the warmth of his skin, the soft baby scent, it all hit Alexander with unexpected force. Tears he didn't know he had began to roll down his cheeks. Hello, Michael, he whispered. I'm Alexander. And I promise you that, no matter what, you'll never be alone. As he held the baby, Alexander felt something inside him transform. He was no longer just the heir to the Morgans, the young millionaire who appeared on magazine covers. He was something more, something he couldn't yet fully define, but which he knew would change his life forever. What Alexander didn't know at that moment was that his act of kindness was about to trigger a series of events that would shake not only his life, but that of the entire community. Fate had set its gears in motion, and nothing would ever be the same again. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Alexander left the hospital. Exhausted, but with a new determination in his gaze, he headed to his car, not noticing the small group of reporters that had gathered at the entrance. Mr. Morgan! Mr. Morgan! The shouts took him by surprise. Camera flashes blinded him momentarily. Is it true that you saved an abandoned baby? Alexander blinked, confused. How had they found out so quickly? He tried to dodge the questions, but the reporters were insistent. Please, not now, he said, trying to reach his car. Is it true that you broke a car window to rescue the child? Asked a reporter, bringing a microphone to his face. Alexander stopped. He knew he couldn't avoid this for long. He took a deep breath and turned to the reporters. Yes, it's true, he finally said. I found an abandoned baby in a car and brought him to the hospital. That's all I can say for now. His words, though brief, were enough to unleash a media storm within hours. The story of the young millionaire who had saved an abandoned baby was on every news channel and social media platform Alexander arrived at, his penthouse, hoping to find a refuge from the madness, only to discover that his phone wouldn't stop ringing congratulatory messages, interview requests, even offers to write a book about the incident. It was overwhelming. He turned on the television, only to see himself on every channel. Presenters were debating his action, some praising him as a hero, others questioning his motives. Is this an attempt to improve the image of Morgan Enterprises? Asked an analyst on a debate show. We can't ignore the fact that the Morgan company has been involved in labor scandals recently, added another. Alexander turned off the television, feeling sick. How could they question his motives? He had only wanted to help a baby in danger, hadn't thought about publicity or the company's image. His phone rang once more. It was his adoptive mother, Victoria Morgan. Alexander, darling. Her voice sounded tense. What's going on? You're on all the news. Alexander sighed. Mom, No? Don't say anything else, Victoria interrupted him. Your father and I are coming over. We need to handle this properly. Before he could protest, Victoria had hung up Alexander, collapsed onto the sofa, suddenly feeling exhausted. How had something that had seemed so simple, so right, turned into this? Half an hour later, the doorbell rang. Alexander opened the door to find the worried faces of Victoria and Richard Morgan. "Son," Richard began, entering the penthouse, "we understand you wanted to help, but you have to think about the consequences of your actions." Consequences. Alexander couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Dad, I saved a baby's life. What consequences could there be?" Victoria sat down, smoothing her impeccable skirt. "Darling, it's not that. Simple people are questioning the motives behind your action. Some suggest it's a publicity stunt." A publicity stunt? Alexander felt anger growing inside him. "Do they think I would risk a baby's life for publicity?" "Of course not," said Richard, trying to calm the situation. "But we have to handle this carefully. The company's image is at stake." "The company's image?" Alexander couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Is that all you care about?" "Alexander," Victoria's voice was soft but firm, "we understand your intentions were good, but you have to understand that every action you take has repercussions not just for you but for the whole family and the company." Alexander looked at his adoptive parents, feeling a mixture of frustration and disappointment. "I can't believe we're having this conversation. Don't you understand that I saved a life? How can that be something bad?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Son, we're not saying what you did is wrong. It's just that things are complicated when you're in our position." "Complicated?" Alexander let out a bitter laugh. "What's complicated about doing the right thing?" Victoria approached him, trying to put a hand on his shoulder, but Alexander moved away. "Darling, we understand this is important to you, but you have to think about the bigger picture. The press is speculating about the baby's parents. Some suggest they might be undocumented immigrants." Alexander frowned. "And what does that matter?" "It matters," Richard said firmly, "because our company has government contracts. We can't be seen as sympathizers of illegal immigration." His adoptive father's words hit Alexander like a slap. "Are you suggesting I should have let that baby die just because his parents might be undocumented?" "Of course not," Victoria exclaimed, horrified. "We're just saying we need to handle the situation carefully. Maybe it would be better if you stayed away from the case for a while." Alexander couldn't believe what he was hearing. He moved away from his parents, looking out the window at the city stretching below. For the first time, he felt completely alone in that luxurious penthouse. "I can't do that," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't just ignore what happened and go on with my life as if nothing happened." "Alexander," Richard's voice sounded tired, "I understand you feel connected to this baby, but no, you don't understand." Alexander turned, his eyes shining with a mixture of pain and determination. "You adopted me, gave me a life many can only dream of. But before that, I was like that baby alone, vulnerable, at the mercy of a system that doesn't really care about children." Victoria and Richard exchanged surprised looks. They had never heard Alexander talk like this about his past. "Son," Victoria began, her voice soft, "we never wanted you to feel—" "I know," Alexander interrupted her. "I know you love me, that you've done everything possible to give me a good life. But there are so many children out there who aren't that lucky. I can't just turn my back on them." Richard approached his son, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Alexander, I understand how you feel, but you have to be realistic. You can't save all the children in the world." "Maybe not," Alexander replied, his voice full of determination. "But I can try. And I'm going to start with Michael." "Michael?" Victoria asked, confused. "The baby," Alexander explained. "I named him Michael, and I'm going to do everything possible to help him and his family, no matter who they are or where they come from." Richard and Victoria exchanged worried looks. They could see the determination in their son's eyes and knew that nothing they said would change his mind. "Alexander," Richard finally said, "just be careful, okay? I don't want you to get hurt." Alexander nodded, grateful for the small gesture of understanding. "I will, Dad. But I have to do this." When his parents left, Alexander was left alone in his penthouse, looking at the city spread out before him. He knew that the path he had chosen would not be easy, that he would face opposition not only from his family but from many others. But for the first time in his life, he felt he had a real purpose. He took out his phone and dialed the hospital number. "Hello, this is Alexander Morgan. I want to know how the baby I brought in yesterday is doing, Michael. And also, have they found his parents?" As he waited for the answer, Alexander knew that his life was about to change forever, and he was ready to face whatever came. The following days were a whirlwind for Alexander, between the constant calls from the press, tense meetings with the board of directors of Morgan Enterprises, and his daily visits to the hospital to see Michael. He barely had time to breathe. It was during one of these hospital visits that he finally met Michael's mother. He was sitting next to the incubator, talking softly to the baby, when a young woman came running into the room, her face stained with tears and an expression of pure terror in her eyes. "My baby!" she cried in Spanish, running towards the incubator. "Carlos, my little Carlos!" Alexander jumped up, surprised by the sudden intrusion. The woman, who didn't seem to be more than 20 years old, looked at him with a mixture of fear and distrust. "Who are you?" she asked, placing herself protectively between Alexander and the incubator. "What are you doing with my son?" Alexander raised his hands in a reassuring gesture. "Calm down. I'm Alexander Morgan. I was the one who found your baby in the car." The woman's eyes widened, recognition shining in them. You saved my Carlos." Alexander nodded, suddenly feeling uncomfortable under the intense gaze of the young mother. "Yes, anyone would have done the same." The woman burst into tears, falling to her knees next to the incubator. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Alexander knelt beside her, not knowing what to do. "It's okay," he said softly. "The baby is fine now. The doctors say he will recover completely." The woman looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and shame. I didn't want to leave him," she said between sobs. "But I had to go to work, and my sister, who usually takes care of him, was sick, and I didn't know what to do." Alexander felt his heart sink. He could see the pain and desperation in the young mother's eyes. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Maria," she responded, wiping away her tears. "Maria Gonzalez." "Maria," said Alexander, "I understand you were in a difficult situation, but leaving a baby alone in a car is very dangerous. He could have died." Maria nodded, tears falling down her cheeks again. I know I'm a terrible mother, but I had no choice. If I lost my job, how would I feed my son?" Alexander was silent for a moment, processing what he had just heard. Suddenly, all the discussions about corporate image and public relations seemed insignificant in the face of the harsh reality of this young mother's daily struggle. "Maria," he said finally, "can you tell me more about your situation? I want to understand." Maria looked at him cautiously, but something in Alexander's expression must have convinced her of his sincerity. Slowly, she began to tell her story. She had arrived in the United States 3 years ago, fleeing violence in her home country. She worked long hours in low-paying jobs, sending most of her money to her family in Mexico. When she became pregnant, the baby's father abandoned her. Since then, she had been struggling alone to support herself and her son. "I don't have papers," she finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I live in constant fear of being deported and separated from my son." Alexander felt a lump forming in his throat. Maria's story was a stark reminder of the struggles faced by so many immigrants, struggles that he, in his bubble of privilege, had barely considered before. "Maria," he said, making a decision in that moment. "I want to help you." You and Carlos, Maria, looked at him with a mixture of hope and distrust. "Why? Why would you want to help us?" Alexander looked at little Carlos in the incubator, remembering his own childhood, the years of loneliness before the Morgans adopted him. "Because everyone deserves a chance," he said simply, "and because no one should have to choose between caring for their child and being able to feed them." At that moment, a nurse entered the room. "Mrs. Gonzalez," she said, her voice tense, There are some immigration officers who want to speak with you." Terror seized Maria's face. She looked at Alexander. Her eyes pleading for help, Alexander stood up, a new determination on his face. "Don't worry, Maria," he said, heading towards the door. "I'll take care of this." As he left the room to confront the immigration officers, Alexander knew that this was the moment that would define the rest of his life. It was no longer just about helping an abandoned baby. It was about confronting an unjust system, about using his privilege and power to make a real difference in the lives of people like Maria and Carlos, and he was ready for the battle ahead. Alexander walked determinedly towards the hospital hallway, where two immigration officers were waiting with stern expressions. He could feel the weight of Maria's gaze on his back, filled with fear and hope. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," said Alexander, keeping his voice calm and professional. "I'm Alexander Morgan. How can I help you?" The officers exchanged looks of surprise as they recognized the famous Morgan heir. "Mr. Morgan," said one of them, quickly recovering, "we're here to talk to Maria Gonzalez about her immigration status." Alexander nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "I understand, however, Mrs. Gonzalez is currently under medical care and is not in a condition to be questioned. Additionally, her newborn son needs constant attention." "Mr. Morgan," said the other officer, his tone becoming harsher, "we appreciate your concern, but this is a matter of national security. We have reports that Mrs. Gonzalez is in the country illegally." Alexander felt anger growing inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I understand your position, officers, but I also understand that you're here to enforce the law, correct?" The officers nodded, somewhat confused by the turn in the conversation. "Good," Alexander continued. "Then you'll also understand that the law protects people who are cooperating in a criminal investigation. In this case, Mrs. Gonzalez is a key witness in a child neglect case that I'm personally investigating." The officers looked at each other, clearly surprised by this information. "We had no knowledge of any investigation," said one of them. "It's a private investigation," Alexander responded confidently, "and I assure you that Mrs. Gonzalez is fully cooperating. Removing the mother of a newborn at this time would not only be inhumane, but would also obstruct an ongoing investigation." The officers seemed undecided, not knowing how to proceed. Alexander pressed his advantage. "I propose the following," he said. "Let Mrs. Gonzalez remain here with her son until he fully recovers. Meanwhile, I personally commit to ensuring that she complies with all necessary legal procedures to regularize her situation. You have my word that she won't attempt to evade the authorities." There was a moment of tense silence as the officers considered the proposal. Finally, the one who seemed to be in charge spoke. "Very well, Mr. Morgan. We'll trust your word for now, but we'll be watching this situation closely." Alexander nodded, feeling immense relief. "Thank you for your understanding, gentlemen. I'll keep you informed of any developments." When the officers left, Alexander leaned against the wall, letting out a long sigh. He had bought time, but he knew this was just the beginning of a long battle. He returned to Carlos's room, where he found Maria hugging the baby, tears of relief running down her cheeks. "What happened?" she asked, fear still evident in her voice. Alexander sat down next to her, suddenly feeling exhausted. "They're willing to wait for now," he said. "But Maria, we need to talk about how we're going to handle this in the long term." Maria nodded, gently rocking. "Carlos, why are you doing this for us, Mr. Morgan? You don't even know us." Alexander looked at the baby, remembering the moment he found him in that hot car. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply, "and because I believe everyone deserves a fair chance." At that moment, Alexander's phone began to ring insistently. He looked at the screen and saw it was his adoptive father, Richard. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Dad, now is not a good time," Alexander said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Alexander," Richard's voice sounded tense, "I need you to come to the office immediately. The board of directors has called an emergency meeting." Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Dad, I'm in the middle of something important here at the hospital." "This can't wait, son," Richard insisted. "Your future in the company is at stake." Alexander looked at Maria and Carlos, feeling like he was at a crossroads. On one side was the family business, everything he had known for most of his life. On the other was this small family that desperately needed his help. "I'll be there in an hour," he finally said, hanging up the phone. He turned to Maria, who was looking at him with concern. "I have to leave for a while," he explained, "but I'll be back, I promise. Meanwhile, stay here with Carlos. You're safe." Maria nodded, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan. God bless you." Alexander left the hospital feeling torn. As he drove towards the offices of Morgan Enterprises, he couldn't stop thinking about how drastically his life had changed in just a few days. When he arrived at the imposing glass and steel building that housed the company's headquarters, Alexander took a moment to compose himself. He knew that what he was about to face wouldn't be easy. In the boardroom, he found the members of the board of directors seated around the long mahogany table. His adoptive parents, Richard and Victoria, were at the head, their faces tense. "Alexander," Richard began, his voice grave. "The board has expressed serious concerns about your recent actions and how they're affecting the company's image." Alexander looked around, seeing the stern expressions of the board members. "My actions?" he asked. "You mean saving a baby's life?" "It's not that simple, Alexander," Victoria intervened. "Your actions, although well-intentioned, have put the company in a delicate position. We're receiving pressure from our shareholders and business partners." One of the board members, a middle-aged man with metal-framed glasses, cleared his throat. "Mr. Morgan, we understand that your intentions were good, but getting involved with undocumented immigrants could have serious consequences for our government contracts." Alexander felt anger growing inside him. Serious consequences, more serious than letting an innocent baby die. "Nobody is saying that," said Richard, trying to calm the situation. "But you have to understand that your actions have repercussions beyond yourself." "I understand perfectly," Alexander replied, his voice firm. "I understand that we have the power to make a real difference in people's lives. Isn't that more important than some contracts?" The room fell silent for a moment, everyone surprised by the vehemence in Alexander's voice. Finally, another board member spoke. "Mr. Morgan, we appreciate your passion, but as the future leader of this company, you must think about the bigger picture. We suggest you publicly distance yourself from this incident and allow our public relations team to handle the situation." Alexander looked at his parents, seeking support, but only saw concern on their faces. At that moment, he knew he had to make a decision. "No," he said simply. "No." Richard repeated, surprised. "I won't distance myself," Alexander continued, his voice gaining strength. "In fact, I intend to do the exact opposite. I'm going to use my position and the resources of this company to help Maria and her son, and others like them." The room erupted in a chorus of indignant voices. Victoria stood up, trying to calm the situation. "Alexander, please think about what you're saying." But Alexander had already made his decision. "I've thought about this more than I've thought about anything else in my life," he said. "If this company can't use its power to do good, then maybe it's not the company I want to lead." With those words, Alexander turned and left the room, leaving everyone in a state of shock. As he walked towards the elevator, he felt a mixture of fear and liberation. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he felt he was doing the right thing. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. "Mr. Morgan, this is Elena, Maria's sister. We urgently need your help. Can we meet?" Alexander responded immediately. "Of course. Tell me where and when." As he descended in the elevator, Alexander knew he was about to embark on a journey that would change his life forever, and he was ready to face any challenge that stood in his way. The sun was setting over the city when Alexander arrived at the small cafe where Elena, Maria's sister, had asked to meet him. The place was in a modest neighborhood, far from the skyscrapers and luxury restaurants Alexander usually frequented. He entered the cafe, feeling out of place in his expensive suit. He immediately noticed a young woman sitting in a corner, nervously looking around, her eyes, the same color as Maria's, lit up with recognition when she saw Alexander. "Mr. Morgan," she asked quietly, as Alexander approached her table. Alexander nodded, sitting down across from her. "Elena, right? How are Maria and Carlos?" Elena nervously twisted the napkin between her hands. "They're fine, thanks to you, but we have problems." "Tell me," said Alexander, leaning forward. Elena took a deep breath before beginning. "Our landlord found out about what happened. He says he doesn't want trouble with immigration and is kicking us out. Maria has nowhere to go with Carlos when they leave the hospital." Alexander felt anger growing inside him. "That's illegal. He can't evict you like that." Elena let out a bitter laugh. "Mr. Morgan, laws don't always protect people like us. Besides, who's going to help us fight against him?" "I will," said Alexander without hesitation. "I'll hire the best lawyer in the city if necessary." Elena looked at him with a mixture of hope and caution. "Why? Why are you doing all this for us?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, thinking about how to respond. Finally, he decided to be honest. "Because when I was a child, before the Morgans adopted me, I was also alone and scared. I swore that if I ever had the power to help someone in that situation, I would—" Elena's eyes softened with understanding. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "Almost nobody knows," said Alexander with a small smile. "But that doesn't matter now. What matters is helping your sister and Carlos." At that moment, Alexander's phone began to ring. It was Victoria. Alexander hesitated before answering. "Son?" Victoria's voice sounded tired. "The board has made a decision. They want you to take some time away from the company until this situation calms down." Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision. "And you, Mom, what do you think?" There was a long silence before Victoria answered. I think you're doing what you believe is right, and I'm proud of you for that. But I'm also worried, Alexander. This could cost you your future in the company." "I know," Alexander said softly, "but there are more important things than the company, Mom." "I understand," said Victoria, and Alexander could hear the emotion in her voice. "Just be careful, okay?" "I will," Alexander promised before hanging up. Elena was looking at him with concern. "Problems?" Alexander shook his head. "Nothing I can't handle. Now, let's talk about how we can help your sister and Carlos." Over the next few hours, Alexander and Elena drew up a plan. Alexander would use his contacts to find a new place where Maria and Carlos could live safely. He would also hire a lawyer specializing in immigration to help Maria regularize her situation. As they talked, Alexander couldn't help but notice Elena's intelligence and determination. Despite the difficulties she had faced, she had an inner strength that Alexander found admirable. "Elena," said Alexander when they finished planning, "I want to offer you a job." Elena looked at him surprised. "A job? What are you talking about?" "I'm thinking of creating a foundation," Alexander explained, "to help immigrant families like yours. I need someone who really understands the challenges they face. Someone like you." Elena was speechless for a moment. I don't know what to say. I don't have experience in something like this." "You have the most important experience," said Alexander with a smile. "You've lived this, you know the struggles, the fears, the hopes. That's more valuable than any university degree." Elena looked at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of emotion and determination. "If you really think I can help, then yes, I accept." Alexander extended his hand, and Elena took it. At that moment, both felt they were on the verge of something big, something that could change not only their lives, but the lives of many others. When they left the cafe, night had fallen over the city. Alexander looked at the lights shining in the distance, feeling a new determination in his heart. "Are you ready for this?" he asked Elena. She nodded, a brave smile on her face. Ready together, they walked towards the uncertain future that awaited them, knowing they would face many challenges, but also with the hope that they could make a real difference in the world. What Alexander didn't know at that moment was that this decision would not only change his life and Eleanor's, but would also lead him on a journey of self-discovery that would reveal long-buried secrets about his own past. The following days were a whirlwind of activity for Alexander, between helping Maria and Carlos settle into their new home, starting the legal procedures for the foundation and dealing with the constant pressure from the board of directors of Morgan Enterprises. He barely had time to breathe. However, amid the chaos, Alexander found an unexpected anchor in Elena. Her sharp intelligence and deep understanding of the challenges immigrants faced proved invaluable as they worked together to shape the foundation. One afternoon, while reviewing documents in the small office Alexander had rented for the foundation, Elena looked up from her computer with a thoughtful expression. "Alexander," she said, using his first name as he had insisted she do, "there's something I don't understand. Why risk so much for this? Your family, your company, you're putting everything on the line." Alexander leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "I guess I feel it's the right thing to do, that it's what I'm here for." Elena looked at him curiously. "There's more, isn't there? Something you're not saying?" Alexander sighed, surprised by Elena's insight. "You're right," he admitted. "There is something else, something I haven't even told my adoptive parents." Elena waited patiently as Alexander gathered his thoughts. "When I was very young, before the Morgans adopted me, I remember my biological mother," Alexander began, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't remember her face, but I remember her voice. She spoke Spanish." Elena's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you?" Alexander nodded. "I think so. I think my biological parents were immigrants. I don't know what happened to them, why I ended up in the adoption system. But since I found Carlos in that car, it's like something has awakened inside me. As if I finally understood why I've always felt different." Elena reached out across the table, taking Alexander's hand. "That must be very difficult to process." Alexander felt an unexpected warmth at Elena's touch. "It is. But it also gives me a purpose. I feel like I'm honoring my biological parents, whoever they were. By doing this, have you thought about looking for them?" Elena asked softly. Alexander let out a shaky sigh. "I've thought about it. Yes, but I don't know if I'm ready. What if I discover they abandoned me? Or worse, that they were deported and I never had the chance to know them?" Elena gently squeezed his hand. "I understand your fear, Alexander, but I also believe you deserve to know the truth about your past. It could help you understand yourself better." Alexander nodded slowly. "You're right, maybe it's time to start looking for answers." At that moment, Alexander's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Frowning, he answered. "Alexander Morgan?" asked a deep voice on the other end of the line. "Yes, that's me." "Mr. Morgan, this is Detective Garcia from the police department. We have a situation that requires your immediate presence." Alexander felt his blood run cold. "What happened? Is it about Maria and Carlos?" "No, sir. It's about your adoptive parents. There's been an accident." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Alexander could barely mutter an "I'm on my way" before, hanging up. Elena was looking at him with concern. "What's wrong?" "My parents," said Alexander, his voice barely audible. "There's been an accident. I have to go to the hospital." Elena stood up immediately. "I'm coming with you." Alexander wanted to protest, to say it wasn't necessary, but the truth was he needed the support. He nodded silently, and together they hurried out of the office. The trip to the hospital was a blur. Alexander clung to the steering wheel, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and fears. Elena remained silent beside him, a comforting presence amid the chaos. At the hospital, they were greeted by Detective Garcia, a middle-aged man with tired eyes. "Mr. Morgan," said the detective, "your parents were on their way to a meeting when their car was hit by another vehicle. The driver of the other car fled the scene." "How are they?" asked Alexander, his voice shaking. "Your mother is stable with some bruises and a fractured arm. Your father—" The detective paused, and Alexander felt his heart stop. "Your father is in surgery. His condition is critical." Alexander staggered, feeling as if the ground was opening up beneath his feet. Eleanor held him, her arm firm around his waist. "Can I see them?" asked Alexander. The detective nodded. "Your mother is conscious. You can see her now." Alexander looked at Elena, who nodded in understanding. "Go," she said softly. "I'll be here if you need me." With trembling steps, Alexander followed a nurse to his mother's room. Victoria lay in the bed, her arm in a sling and her face bruised, but her eyes lit up when she saw Alexander. "My son," she said, extending her uninjured hand towards him. Alexander ran to her, taking her hand and kissing it softly. "Mom," he whispered, tears running down his cheeks. "How do you feel?" "I'll be fine," said Victoria, though Alexander could see the pain in her eyes. "Your father." "He's in surgery," Alexander said softly. "He's strong, Mom. He'll pull through." Victoria nodded, but Alexander could see the fear in her eyes. "Alexander," she said after a moment, "there's something you need to know. Something your father and I have kept for years." Alexander felt his heart race. "What is it, Mom?" Victoria took a shaky breath. "The accident, it wasn't an accident. I think someone was trying to hurt us." "What? Why?" "Because of you, son. Because of what you're doing with your foundation." Alexander gasped. "But how is that possible?" Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. "There are things about your past, about your biological parents, that we haven't told you. Things that could endanger a lot of powerful people if they come to light." Alexander felt the world spinning around him. "Mom, what are you saying?" Before Victoria could answer, the door burst open. A doctor rushed in. "Mrs. Morgan, Mr. Morgan," said the doctor, his voice urgent. "It's your husband. There have been complications in the surgery." Alexander felt the ground opening up beneath his feet once again. He looked at his mother, seeing the terror reflected in her eyes. At that moment, Alexander knew his life was about to change forever. The secrets of the past were emerging, and with them, a danger he had never imagined. As he followed the doctor out of the room, his heart pounding frantically, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about his mother's words. What secrets did his past hold? And who would be willing to kill to keep them hidden? The answer to these questions would lead him on a journey that would unravel not only the mysteries of his own past, but also a web of corruption and deceit that extended far beyond what he could have ever imagined. The following hours were a blur for Alexander. His father Richard's surgery had become complicated, and the doctors were struggling to stabilize him. Victoria, still recovering, refused to leave the hospital, and Alexander found himself torn between caring for his parents and the growing anxiety over his mother's words. It was Elena who pulled him out of his stupor, appearing with coffee and an unwavering determination in her eyes. "Alexander," she said softly, handing him a steaming cup, "I know you're worried about your parents, but we need to talk about what your mother said. If someone is after you, we need to find out why." Alexander nodded slowly, feeling the weight of reality fall upon him. "You're right," he said, "but I don't know where to start all of this. It's too much." Elena looked at him with a mixture of compassion and determination. "Let's start at the beginning. What do you know exactly about your biological parents?" Alexander frowned, trying to remember. "Almost nothing. The Morgans adopted me when I was 5 years old. Before that, I was in foster homes. I always assumed my biological parents had abandoned me or had died." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "And you never tried to find out more?" "No," Alexander admitted. "I guess I was afraid of what I might discover, and the Morgans. They were always my parents in every way that mattered." "I understand," Elena said softly, "but now with what your mother said, it seems there's more to this story. We need to start investigating." At that moment, Detective Garcia approached them. "Mr. Morgan," he said, his voice grave, "we've found the vehicle that hit your parents' car. It was abandoned on the outskirts of the city." Alexander straightened up, feeling a mixture of fear and anticipation. "And the driver?" The detective shook his head. "No trace of him, but—" He paused as if hesitating to continue. "But what?" Alexander pressed. "We found something in the car, an envelope with your name on it." Alexander felt his blood run cold. "An envelope? What did it contain?" The detective pulled an envelope from his jacket and handed it to Alexander. "We haven't opened it. It's evidence, but given that it's addressed to you, With trembling hands, Alexander took the envelope. It was a simple manila envelope with his name handwritten on the front. He opened it, slowly, aware of the intense gazes of Eleanor and the detective. Inside was a single sheet of paper and an old photograph. Alexander first took out the photograph and felt the air leave his lungs. It was an image of a young couple holding a baby. The woman had the same eyes as Alexander, and the man his same smile. There was no doubt. They were his biological parents. With his heart pounding frantically, Alexander unfolded the sheet of paper. On it, handwritten, was a message. The truth cannot remain buried forever. Your past and your present are more connected than you think. If you want answers, look for the woman with the emerald necklace, but be careful, Alexander. There are those who would kill to keep these secrets hidden. Alexander looked up, his mind spinning Elena, and the detective were looking at him with concern. What does it say? Elena asked softly. Alexander showed them the photograph and read them the message. Detective Garcia frowned deeply. Mr. Morgan, he said, his voice filled with concern, this is no longer a simple accident. We're dealing with something much bigger. Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of the situation on his shoulders. I know, and I have to get to the bottom of this. Elena took his hand, surprising him with the gesture. You won't do it alone, she said firmly. I'm with you in this. Alexander looked at her, grateful for her support. But before he could respond, a nurse came running up. Mr. Morgan, she said, breathless. Your father, he's awake, he's asking to see you. Alexander felt a wave of relief mixed with anxiety. He looked at Elena and the detective. I have to go, he said. Go, Elena replied. I'll be here when you get back. As he followed the nurse to his father's room, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about the photograph and the message. Who were his biological parents, really? And what secrets so dangerous did they hold that someone would be willing to kill for them? As he entered Richard's room, Alexander knew he was about to embark on a journey that would change his life forever. A journey that would lead him to discover not only the truth about his past, but also about the present he had built and the future he longed. For with each step he took towards his adoptive father's bed, Alexander felt he was getting closer not only to the answers he sought, but also to a destiny that, without knowing it, had been waiting for him all his life. Alexander entered the hospital room with his heart pounding frantically. Richard lay in the bed, pale and connected to several machines, but with his eyes open and alert. When he saw Alexander, a weak smile appeared on his face. My son, Richard said in a hoarse voice. Alexander rushed to his side, taking his adoptive father's hand. Dad, he whispered, tears threatening to fall. I was so worried. Richard weakly squeezed Alexander's hand. I'm all right, son, but we need to talk. There's not much time. Alexander frowned. What are you talking about, Dad? You need to rest. Richard shook his head as forcefully as he could. No, Alexander, listen to me. The accident, it wasn't an accident. I know, Alexander said softly. Mum told me, and they found this in the attacker's car. He took out the photograph and the note from his pocket. Showing them to Richard, Richard's eyes opened with surprise and then filled with sadness. Oh, Alexander, he sighed. We hoped we could protect you from this forever. Protect me from what? Alexander asked, frustration growing in his voice. Who are these people? Are they really my biological parents? Richard nodded slowly. Yes, they are. And the story of how you came to us is much more complicated than we've led you to believe. Alexander sat in the chair next to the bed, feeling the world spinning around him. Tell me everything. Dad, please. Richard took a shaky breath before beginning. Your biological parents, Michael and Sofia Hernandez, were activists. They fought against corruption and human trafficking at the border. They had evidence that could bring down powerful politicians and entire cartels. Alexander listened, stunned as Richard continued. One day they discovered something big, something that endangered very powerful people. They knew they would come for them, so they brought you to us, Victoria. And I were friends of your parents, though few knew it. They asked us to take care of you, to keep you safe. What happened to them? Alexander asked. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. as if the memory was too painful. "They disappeared," he finally said. "A week after leaving you with us. They were never found." Alexander felt a lump forming in his throat. Are they dead?" "We don't know for certain," Richard replied, "but after so many years it's likely. I'm sorry, son." Alexander stood up from the chair, walking to the window. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Pain for the parents he never knew, gratitude towards the Morgans for protecting him, and a growing anger towards those who had destroyed his family. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Richard sighed. "We wanted to protect you. The less you knew, the safer you would be. But now that you've started this foundation, that you're helping immigrants and fighting corruption, you've caught the attention of the same people your parents faced." Alexander turned to Richard, his eyes shining with a mixture of determination and fear. "Who are these people? Who's behind all this?" "We don't know specific names," Richard said, "but it's a network of corrupt politicians, unscrupulous businessmen, and cartels, the same people your parents were fighting against." At that moment, the door to the room opened, and Elena rushed in. "Alexander," she said, breathless, "I just got a call. Maria and Carlos, they've disappeared." Alexander felt the ground open up beneath his feet. "What? How is that possible?" Elena shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "I don't know. I went to see them, and the apartment was empty. There are signs of a struggle." Richard sat up in bed, his face pale from the effort. "They're using your friends to get to you. Alexander, you have to be careful." Alexander looked at the photograph of his biological parents, then at Richard, and finally at Elena. At that moment he knew he was at a crossroads. He could step back, abandon his mission, and maybe be safe. Or he could move forward, face the danger and fight for the truth and justice that his biological parents had defended. "I'm not going to hide," he finally said, his voice full of determination. "I'm going to find Maria and Carlos, and I'm going to uncover the truth about my parents and who's behind all this." Elena approached him, taking his hand. "You won't do it alone. I'm with you in this." Richard nodded from the bed. "And we'll support you in everything we can. But Alexander, you have to. Promise me you'll be careful. These people are dangerous." Alexander looked at his adoptive father, feeling a wave of love and gratitude. "I will, Dad, I promise you." At that moment, Detective Garcia entered the room. "Mr. Morgan," he said, his voice grave, "we have a lead on the woman with the emerald necklace mentioned in the note. We believe she might be a former collaborator of your biological parents." Alexander exchanged glances with Eleanor and then with Richard. "It's time to go after the truth," he said. As he left the hospital room with Elena and Detective Garcia, Alexander felt he was on the edge of a precipice. Behind him lay the life he had known, full of privileges, but also of secrets. Ahead stretched an uncertain path, full of dangers but also the promise of answers and justice. With each step he took, Alexander felt he was getting closer, not only to the truth about his past, but also to his true destiny. A destiny that, without knowing it, he had been waiting all his life to fulfill. What he didn't know was that this path would lead him to face not only powerful enemies, but also his own fears and doubts. And in the process he would discover an inner strength he never knew he had, and a love that would defy all odds. The search for the mysterious woman with the emerald necklace led Alexander and Elena to the darkest corners of the city. Detective Garcia had provided them with a lead, an old bar in the Latino neighborhood, known as a meeting point for activists and journalists. As they approached the bar, Alexander couldn't help but notice the tension on Elena's face. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked softly. "You can still back out." Elena looked at him with determination. "Don't even dream of it. We're in this together, remember?" Alexander nodded, grateful for her presence. Together they entered the dim, smoke-filled bar. The place was almost empty, with only a few scattered customers at the tables. Alexander approached the bar, where an older man was cleaning glasses with a dirty rag. "We're looking for a woman," Alexander said in a low voice. "A woman with an emerald necklace." The bartender looked at him suspiciously. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Kid," Alexander was about to insist when Elena grabbed his arm. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a woman sitting alone in a dark corner. The woman was older, maybe in her 60s, with grey hair pulled back in a tight bun, and around her neck gleamed a necklace with an emerald. Alexander and Elena slowly approached her table. The woman looked up, her sharp eyes assessing them. "Ma'am," Alexander began, "we're looking for information about Michael and Sofia Hernandez." The woman visibly tensed at hearing those names. "I don't know who you're talking about," she said, starting to get up. Elena gently stopped her. "Please," she said. "It's important. It's about his parents," she added, pointing to Alexander. The woman paused, looking at Alexander with new eyes. Are you Michael and Sophia's son?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alexander nodded. "Yes, and I need to know the truth about what happened to them." The woman looked around nervously before sitting back down. "My name is Carmen," she finally said. "I worked with your parents. We were part of a network of activists fighting against corruption and human trafficking at the border." Alexander and Elena sat down, listening intently, as Carmen spoke in a low voice. "Your parents were brave," Carmen continued. "Too brave. They uncovered a trafficking operation that involved high-level politicians and the most dangerous cartels. They had evidence that could bring down the entire corrupt system." "What happened?" Alexander asked, his heart beating hard. Carmen closed her eyes for a moment. "They were discovered. They had to flee. They left you with the Morgans to keep you safe, and then they disappeared." "Are they dead?" Alexander could barely ask the question. Carmen shook her head. "I don't know for certain, but there are rumors that they're still alive, hiding somewhere in Mexico." Alexander felt his breath catch. Could his parents be alive? Elena took his hand under the table, offering silent support. "Why are you telling me this now?" Alexander asked. "Why the message in the car that attacked my adoptive parents?" Carmen looked at him intently. "Because your parents' fight isn't over. The evidence they collected, it still exists. And now that you've started this foundation, you've caught the attention of the same people your parents faced. They're scared, Alexander. Scared that you might uncover the truth and continue your parents' work." At that moment, Alexander's phone vibrated. It was a message from Detective Garcia. "We have a lead on Maria and Carlos. Come quickly." Alexander looked at Elena and then at Carmen. "We have to go," he said, "but I need to know more." "How can I find that evidence? How can I find my parents?" Carmen pulled a small flash drive from her pocket. "This contains part of the information your parents gathered. The rest is hidden. Only your parents know where." Alexander took the flash drive, feeling it heavy in his hand despite its small size. "Thank you," he said, "but how can I trust that this is real? How do I know it's not a trap?" Carmen smiled sadly. "You don't know, but your father always said, the truth is a risk worth taking. Now it's up to you to decide if you want to take that risk." Alexander and Elena stood up, ready to leave, but before they could take a step, Carmen stopped them. "One last thing," she said, her voice grave. "Be careful who you trust, Alexander. The enemy has many faces, and some of them might be the ones you least expect." With those cryptic words ringing in their ears, Alexander and Elena left the bar, plunging into the city night. As they headed to meet Detective Garcia, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about everything he had discovered. His parents could be alive. There was a conspiracy involving the highest spheres of power, and now he had in his hands information that could change everything. He looked at Elena, who was driving silently beside him. "What have I gotten myself into?" he murmured. Elena returned his gaze, a mixture of fear and determination in her eyes. "Something important," she replied. "Something that could make a real difference." Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew that every step he took from now on would bring him closer to danger, but it would also bring him closer to the truth, to justice, and maybe to his parents. As the city passed in a blur of lights around them, Alexander knew there was no turning back. The path he had chosen was dangerous, but it was the right path, and with Elena by his side, He felt capable of facing any challenge that stood in his way. What he didn't know was that the greatest challenge was yet to come. A challenge that would test not only his courage and determination, but also his heart. Detective Garcia was waiting for them in an abandoned warehouse, on the outskirts of the city. When Alexander and Elena arrived, they immediately noticed the tension on the detective's face. "What's going on?" Alexander asked, his heart pounding. "Did you find Maria and Carlos?" Garcia nodded slowly. "Yes, but things have gotten complicated." Before he could explain further, footsteps were heard approaching. From the shadows emerged Maria and Carlos, flanked by two armed men. Alexander instinctively took a step forward, but Elena held him back. "Something's not right," she whispered. And she was right, Maria, instead of seeming relieved to see. Alexander looked at him with a mixture of guilt and fear. "I'm sorry, Alexander," Maria said, her voice breaking. "We had no choice." At that moment, a familiar figure stepped out of the shadows and Alexander felt the world stop. It was Victoria, his adoptive mother. "Mom?" Alexander asked, confused. "What's going on?" Victoria looked at him with an expression Alexander had never seen before. Cold, calculating. "I'm sorry, Alexander," she said, "but this has gone too far. We had to stop it." Alexander stepped back, feeling as if he'd been punched in the stomach. You're behind all this?" Victoria nodded. "Your father and we've worked for years to maintain the balance, to keep the system functioning. Your biological parents threatened to destroy everything, and now you're doing the same." Elena stepped forward, placing herself protectively in front of Alexander. "How could you? You adopted him, you raised him." "And we love him," said Victoria, her voice breaking for a moment. "But there are bigger things at stake here. The system we've built, it maintains peace, it maintains order. Yes, there's corruption, but there's also stability." Alexander shook his head, unable to process what he was hearing. Peace, order? At the cost of how many innocent lives? At the cost of justice? At that moment, Detective Garcia pulled out his gun, pointing it at Alexander and Elena. "I'm sorry, kids," he said, "but you have to understand this is bigger than all of us." Alexander looked around, seeing the faces of those he had trusted, Maria, who seemed torn apart by guilt, Detective Garcia, whose loyalty had been bought, and Victoria, the woman who had raised him as her own son, now revealed as the mastermind behind it all. "I can't believe this," Alexander said, his voice barely a whisper. "Everything was everything a lie." Victoria took a step towards him, her expression softening for a moment. "Not everything, darling, we love you, that was always real. But there are things you don't understand." "What don't I understand?" Alexander shouted, anger finally erupting. "That you've been protecting human traffickers? That you've been helping maintain a corrupt system that exploits the most vulnerable?" Elena squeezed his hand, offering silent support. Alexander looked at her, grateful for her presence amid this chaos. Victoria sighed. "It's complicated, Alexander. The world isn't black and white. Sometimes, to maintain peace, compromises have to be made. Compromises." Alexander let out a bitter laugh. "Is that what you call betraying everything that's just and right?" At that moment, a noise was heard outside the warehouse. Everyone tensed, and Detective Garcia pointed his gun towards the door. Suddenly, the door burst open and a familiar figure ran in. It was Richard, Alexander's adoptive father. "Stop!" Richard shouted, panting. "Victoria, this has to end. We can't continue with this." Victoria looked at her husband in surprise. "Richard, what are you doing here? You should be in the hospital." Richard approached limping, still weak from the accident. "I couldn't let this continue. Alexander deserves to know the truth. The whole truth." Alexander looked at Richard, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. "Dad." Richard turned to Alexander, his eyes full of regret. "I'm sorry, son. I should have been braver before. But now is the time to do the right thing." Victoria took a step towards Richard, her voice pleading. "Richard, think about what you're doing. Everything we've worked for." "It doesn't matter anymore," Richard said firmly. "Our son is more important than any system we've helped build." He turned to Alexander and Eleanor. "Your parents are alive," he said. "They're hiding in Mexico, and the evidence they collected, we have it." Victoria gasped. "Richard!" But Richard continued. "We've been keeping it all these years, using it as insurance, but now it's time for it to come to light." Detective Garcia lowered his gun, looking confused. "What's going on here?" Taking advantage of the confusion, Elena acted quickly. In a fluid movement, she disarmed one of the men guarding Maria and Carlos Alexander, following her example, lunged at the other. Amid the ensuing chaos, Richard pulled a flash drive from his pocket and tossed it to Alexander. "Here's everything," he shouted. "All the evidence your parents collected. Use it wisely." Alexander caught the flash drive in mid-air, feeling as if he was holding the weight of the world in his hands. Victoria, seeing everything crumbling, made one last desperate attempt. "Alexander, please, think about what you're doing. This could destroy everything." Alexander looked at her, the pain and disappointment evident in his eyes. "No, Mom, this could fix everything." With Maria, Carlos, and Elena by his side, and Richard covering them, Alexander headed towards the warehouse exit. But before leaving, he turned one last time to Victoria. "I forgive you," he said softly, "but that doesn't mean what you did was right. It's time for the truth to come to light." As they left the warehouse into the night, Alexander knew this was just the beginning. He had the truth in his hands, but now came the hardest part, deciding what to do with it. He looked at Elena, who returned his gaze with a mixture of determination and love. "Are you ready for this?" he asked her. Elena nodded, intertwining her fingers with his. "With you, I'm ready for anything." Together they ventured into the night, ready to face whatever came. The truth was their weapon, and they were determined to use it to bring justice, not just for Alexander's parents, but for all those who had suffered under the weight of corruption and injustice. What they didn't know was that their battle was just beginning, and that the greatest challenge was yet to come. But with the strength of their love and the righteousness of their cause, they were prepared to face any obstacle that stood in their way. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Alexander, Elena, Maria, and Carlos hid in a safe house provided by Richard, while they worked tirelessly to unravel the information contained on the flash drive. What they discovered left them stunned. The drive contained detailed evidence of a corruption network that extended from the highest levels of government to the most dangerous cartels. Names of politicians, businessmen, and high-ranking officials appeared linked to human trafficking operations, money laundering, and extortion. "This is bigger than we imagined," Alexander muttered one night, rubbing his tired eyes as he looked at the computer screen. Eleanor put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know, but it's also our chance to make real change." Meanwhile, Alexander's disappearance and the partial revelation of the conspiracy had caused a stir in the media. Morgan Enterprises was in chaos, with Victoria struggling to maintain control while facing a barrage of questions about her adopted son's whereabouts. It was in the midst of this chaos that Alexander received an unexpected call, an unknown number, a familiar voice, but long forgotten. "Alexander," said the voice, trembling with emotion. It's your mother. Your biological mother, Sophia." Alexander felt the world stop. "Mum?" he whispered, tears springing to his eyes. "Yes, my love," Sophia responded, her voice breaking. "Your father and I, we're alive, and it's time for us to come home." The reunion was arranged in secret, in a small border town. When Alexander saw his biological parents for the first time in over 2 decades, it was as if a lost part of himself finally fell into place. Michael and Sofia Hernandez had aged, their faces marked by years of struggle and exile. But their eyes shone with the same fire that Alexander had inherited. "We're so proud of you," Michael said, embracing his son. "You've continued our fight, even without knowing it." Sophia took Alexander's hands in hers. "But now, my love, the real battle begins." With the family reunited and the evidence in their hands, Alexander knew it was time to act. With the help of Elena, Maria, Carlos, and his biological parents, they devised a plan to expose the truth to the world using Carmen's contacts and other activists. They organized an international press conference. Media from around the world were summoned, promised a revelation that would shake the foundations of power. On the day of the conference, Alexander stood before a sea of cameras and microphones with Elena by his side, and his parents, both biological and adoptive, backing him up. "Today," Alexander began, his voice firm and clear, "we are here to expose a truth that has remained hidden for too long, a truth about corruption, abuse of power, and the exploitation of the most vulnerable in our society." As Alexander spoke, the screens behind him showed document after document, irrefutable evidence of the corruption that had plagued the system for decades. "But today," he continued, "we are not just here to expose the darkness. We are here to light a flame to demonstrate that, with courage and determination, we can face even the most powerful and demand justice." Elena took the microphone, her voice joining Alexander's. "We have seen firsthand the suffering caused by this corrupt system. We have seen families separated, lives destroyed, but we have also seen the strength and resilience of those who refuse to be silenced." As the conference progressed, the world watched in astonishment as one of the greatest conspiracies in modern history unraveled. Names were named, evidence presented, and the truth, so long repressed, finally came to light. In the weeks and months that followed, the impact was seismic. Governments fell, corporations were dismantled, and a global movement for reform and justice began to take shape. Alexander and Elena found themselves at the forefront of this movement, working tirelessly to ensure that the truth was not only heard, but led to real and lasting change. And in the midst of all this, their love, forged in the fire of adversity, only grew stronger. They became a symbol of hope and courage for millions of people around the world. A year after the press conference, Alexander and Elena were on the terrace of a small cafe in the city where it all began. The view of the sunset over the buildings reminded them of how much the world had changed and how much they themselves had changed. "Can you believe it's been a year?" Elena asked, intertwining her fingers with Alexander's. Alexander smiled, bringing Elena's hand to his lips to kiss it softly. "Sometimes it seems like it was yesterday, and other times I feel like a lifetime has passed." The world had certainly changed. The exposure of the corruption network had triggered a wave of reforms around the world. Corrupt politicians had been brought to justice, immigration laws had been reformed, and new measures had been implemented to protect the most vulnerable Morgan enterprises. Under Alexander's new leadership had transformed into a force for good, using its resources to support social causes and promote transparency in business. Victoria and Richard, after a period of reflection and repentance, had decided to dedicate the rest of their lives to amending their mistakes. Working tirelessly on social aid projects, Michael and Sophia, Alexander's biological parents, had returned to their work as activists, this time with the support and resources necessary to make real change without endangering their lives. Maria and Carlos were thriving in their new life. Maria had found stable work, and Carlos was growing up, happy and secure, without the constant fear of deportation. "You know," Alexander said, looking at Elena with love, "in the midst of all this chaos, there was a moment when I thought I had lost everything, but now I realize that I actually gained everything." Elena smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "What do you mean?" Alexander stood up, taking Elena's hands in his. "I mean that I found my true purpose. I found my biological parents. I found a cause worth fighting for." He paused, looking deeply into Elena's eyes. "And I found you." With those words, Alexander knelt down, pulling a small box from his pocket. Elena gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth. "Elena," Alexander said, his voice full of emotion, "you have been by my side in the darkest moments and in the brightest. You have given me strength when I felt I couldn't go on. You have shown me what true courage means." He opened the box, revealing a beautiful ring with an emerald. "Would you do me the honor of marrying me?" Tears were running down Elena's cheeks as she nodded. unable to speak for a moment. Yes. She finally managed to say, yes, 1,000 times yes. Alexander slid the ring onto her finger and stood up, drawing Eleanor into a passionate embrace. Around them, the cafe's customers burst into applause, having witnessed this moment of pure love. As they kissed with the setting sun bathing them in a golden light, Alexander and Elena knew this was just the beginning of their next great adventure. Together, they would continue to fight for justice, inspiring others to have the courage to face adversity and do what's right. Their story, which had begun with an act of courage in a hot parking lot, had become a saga of love, truth, and redemption. And now, as they looked towards the future, they knew that their love would be the force that would guide them through any challenge that might arise. Because in the end, the true act of courage had not been confronting the powerful or exposing the truth. The true act of courage had been opening their hearts to each other and to the world, and daring to believe that love and justice could triumph over darkness. And as the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Alexander and Elena embraced, ready to write the next chapter of their story together.